So we talk a lot about different countries, different economic situations on this show. And, sometimes governments, they try these, I don't know, subtle little nudges to kind of steer things in the right direction,
Like
right?
what?
Well, China, yeah, not so much lately.
Yeah, they're not exactly known for their subtlety.
No, they're not. It's like bringing a bazooka to a knife fight, which I
Mm.
guess is what happens when you're the world's second largest economy and you've got some serious economic woes on your hands.
It's certainly a bold strategy. I mean, the question is, will it be enough to actually tackle this trio of challenges they're facing right now? We're talking about deflation, a deflating real estate bubble, and a youth unemployment rate that, well, let's just say it's setting off alarm bells.
Okay, so let's unpack these, shall we? Starting with deflation. Now, on the surface, I mean, prices going down, that doesn't sound so bad, right? Like, who doesn't love a sale? But I'm sensing it's a bit more insidious than
Oh,
that.
absolutely. It's way more complicated than just, hey, everything's cheaper, yay. It can turn into this really nasty, vicious cycle.
How so?
Okay, imagine this. You're thinking about buying a new phone, but you know prices are trending downwards. So you think, why not wait a few months? I'll get a better deal.
Right.
Now everyone starts thinking like that, and suddenly nobody's buying anything. It just slows the entire economy down to a crawl. And this is already being reflected. We're seeing it in something called China's 10-year bond yields. Basically, it's a measure of investor confidence, and right now those yields are flashing some pretty worrying signals.
Not good. And then there's what's the metaphor? The elephant in the room. Or maybe in this case, it's the empty apartment in the like sprawling, never-ending apartment complex.
Yeah, those ghost cities you hear about, they're a real thing.
So this whole real estate bubble bursting,
Mm-hmm.
is it really as dramatic as the media sometimes makes it sound?
Oh, it's definitely dramatic. And it's not just about empty apartments, right? You have to understand the sheer scale of China's real estate market. I mean, it's massive. And it's not just houses, it's like deeply intertwined with their entire economy.
In what way?
Think about it. Local governments, a huge chunk of their financing comes from land sales to developers. And for everyday people, their homes are often their single biggest investment, much more so than in many other countries. So when that sector weakens, the ripple effects are just enormous. It's like if your retirement fund suddenly went poof, that's what's happening in China on a massive scale right now.
Wow, so you've got this huge amount of wealth tied up in real estate, and it's basically evaporating.
And to try to stop the bleeding, the government's actually stepping in and buying up these empty properties.
Wow. Okay, so you've got deflation, you've got this real estate bubble, and then you've got this potential powder keg, which is the youth unemployment rate.
Oh.
Over 20%, those are staggering numbers. How is that even possible in a country that for decades now has been, touted as this engine of economic growth?
Right, the factory of the world. Yeah, well, the thing is, it's complicated. There are a lot of factors at play, but one of the biggest is demographics.
Yeah.
And it actually goes back to China's one-child policy.
Ah, right, back in the day. Okay.
Yeah, it was intended to control population growth, which, on paper made sense, but it also had some unintended consequences, particularly this gender imbalance.
More men than women.
Exactly. And fast forward to today, you've got this generation grappling with, a really tough job market, way more competition for a limited number of opportunities. And, historically speaking, large numbers of unemployed young men, it's not exactly a recipe for stability.
Whoa, not at all. So you've got economic uncertainty, you've got potential social instability, which is a terrifying combination. So what exactly are they doing with this so-called monetary bazooka to try to address all of this? I mean, what does that even mean?
So basically, picture it as a three-pronged attack, right? First, you've got influencing the reserve requirements. Second, they're aggressively cutting interest rates. And third, they're directly intervening in the stock market. Each one of these is designed to kind of inject a sense of confidence into the system and get people spending again.
Okay, so let's take these one at a time. Reserve requirements. That sounds really important, but I'll admit, I need a refresher. How do those play into this whole situation?
Sure. So in the simplest terms, reserve requirements, it's basically how much cash banks are required to keep on hand at any given time, right?
Okay, yeah.
So by lowering these requirements, which is exactly what China's been doing, and pretty significantly, I might add, it frees up literally trillions of yuan for banks to then lend out. And the hope is that this encourages businesses to invest, to grow, to hire more people, and it encourages consumers to, go out and spend and borrow. It's all about stimulating economic activity.
So it's like they're just trying to loosen the flow of money throughout their entire financial system and hope that that kicks things back into gear. Okay, so that's reserve requirements. What about interest rates? Are we talking like minor tweaks here or something a little more drastic?
Oh, they're not just dipping their toes in the water here. We're talking significant cuts, and the goal is to make borrowing cheaper. The idea is that businesses can borrow money more easily and more cheaply. They'll invest in growth, they'll expand, and if consumers are enticed by these lower rates, maybe they'll finally make those big purchases that they've been putting off, cars, houses, things like that.
Okay, so that's two prongs of the attack. The final one, and this one I'm particularly curious about, is the direct stock market intervention. They're directly injecting cash into the market. So I know that almost sounds like a desperate move to prop things up. Is that too harsh of an assessment?
Well, it certainly sends a message, doesn't it? They're not exactly trying to hide it. They're using a whole bunch of different tools, everything from direct cash infusions to these loan programs specifically designed to support the stock market. And the goal, more than anything, I think, is about projecting confidence, even if the underlying situation is, well, maybe a little more fragile than they'd like us to believe.
So they're pulling out all the stops. They're trying to reignite their economic engine. But the million-dollar question is this sustainable? I mean, is this really going to work, or are they just delaying the inevitable?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And that's what we need to explore further because, these moves, they might provide a temporary boost, a little jolt to the system, but will they actually address the deeper structural issues within China's economy? And will it work this time? Nobody knows for sure.
And perhaps more importantly for our listeners, what does all of this mean for the rest of the world? Because we know what happens in China rarely stings in China, right?
Exactly. When a global economic powerhouse like China makes a move this big, the tremors, they can be felt worldwide.
For sure.
So we need to think about those potential ripple effects, both good and bad.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we'll be diving into next. Stay with us as we explore how China's gamble could impact everything from global markets to your own investment portfolio. All right, so we've established that China is going all in with this monetary intervention. But how have these kinds of moves played out globally in the past? Give us the historical context.
Well, it's rarely simple or predictable, but if we look back at past instances, when China has implemented similar measures, we do see some recurring patterns.
Like what? What kind of patterns are we talking about?
One notable impact tends to be a surge in the U.S. stock market.
Okay.
For instance, during China's last 3 major interventions, we saw gains of up to 20% in the S&P 500.
Wow, 20%. That's not insignificant. It sounds like some investors might actually welcome a little economic turbulence from China if those are the returns.
Yeah, it's certainly a factor to consider, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just stocks. Global real estate markets often experience a ripple effect as well. When more money is circulating globally, it tends to inflate asset prices across the board, at least in the short term.
So a rising tide lifts all boats, at least for a while. But as you mentioned, these are often short-term gains. What about the flip side? Those potential negative ripple effects you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's where things get a little interesting and potentially concerning.
Okay.
One risk is that China's, this flood of cash could actually contribute to global inflation.
Right.
Which is a concern because inflation, that erodes purchasing power, and it can really destabilize economies if it spirals out of control.
Right. That makes sense. So cheaper borrowing might be good for businesses in the short term, but if everything becomes more expensive, it could negate those benefits. What are some other potential downsides?
Well, another concern is the risk of a market bubble.
Oh.
When asset prices rise really rapidly, fueled by speculation rather than genuine economic growth, it creates this unsustainable situation. Eventually, that bubble bursts and the consequences can be really severe.
So it's like we're all holding our breath wondering if this is the start of a sustainable recovery or just a prelude to another financial roller coaster ride. What about crypto? Does all this financial maneuvering in China have any impact on that volatile world?
Ah, Bitcoin. It seems like whenever there's global economic uncertainty or, a major government makes a bold financial move, Bitcoin becomes like the digital asset du jour. Last time China kind of shook things up economically, Bitcoin shot up by a staggering 365%.
365. You're really making me want to brush up on my investing knowledge here.
Yeah.
But let's not forget, we're here to explore the information, not to dispense financial advice.
Precisely. We're all about empowering you with knowledge, but ultimately the decisions are yours to make.
Of course, of course. So we've got potential gains in the stock market, possible inflation and bubbles on the horizon, and Bitcoin doing its usual unpredictable dance. Yeah. But let's circle back to China itself for a moment. They're trying to stimulate their economy, but is it actually working? I mean, are these measures addressing the root causes of their problems, or are they just buying time?
That's the trillion-dollar question, right? While these interventions might offer a temporary reprieve and, a short-term jolt to global markets, the long-term efficacy is very much in question,
Right.
meaning we need to look beyond the headlines and consider the potential consequences of delaying the inevitable. Flooding the market with cash doesn't magically erase the underlying structural issues within China's economy.
So it's like they're trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Could actually make things worse in the long run.
That's a bit extreme.
Okay.
But there's a grain of truth to that analogy. While it might seem like they're taking decisive action, there's a real risk that they're simply postponing a reckoning, potentially creating an even larger problem down the road.
And what about the social consequences within China itself? We touched on youth unemployment earlier, but if this economic gamble doesn't pay off, could we see social unrest on a larger scale?
It's certainly a factor to consider, and one that's, well, difficult to predict with any certainty.
So much uncertainty. But that's the world we live in, right? Especially when it comes to the global economy. So for those of us outside of China, trying to make sense of it all, what are the key takeaways? Should we be preparing for a boom, bracing for a bust, or is it something in between? So we're left with this cloud of uncertainty hanging over everything. China's trying to like really jumpstart their economy, but at what cost? And what does it all mean for, but the rest of us, the average person, just trying to make sense of their own financial lives?
Right, the billion yuan question. And unfortunately, there's no crystal ball here, but but we can look to history, we can use some analysis, hopefully, to kind of guide us. But
Yeah.
I think for someone trying to make sense of all this, the most important thing to remember is that China's actions, they create both opportunities and risks.
Okay, so let's try to unpack that a little bit. Let's say, hypothetically, China's plan works, at least in the short term. The global markets get that boost that some people are predicting. Is that a green light? Do we all just dive in head first?
Well, it depends. Are you the kind of investor who thrives on short-term volatility? Because, those who can stomach the risk and maybe more importantly, time the market perfectly, they might see some gains, particularly in areas like, tech stocks or even crypto, which, as we know, are known for their, shall we say, roller coaster
Right.
tendencies.
Right. A high risk, high reward scenario. But we've also talked about these underlying structural issues in China, the things that they're not really addressing with all this spending. If those problems don't go away, is there a chance this whole thing could just backfire spectacularly?
Yeah, that's the argument for caution, right? There are definitely some analysts out there who believe that by injecting this much cash into the system, China is essentially just masking those deeper problems. They might be, inadvertently inflating a global market bubble that's ultimately unsustainable.
So it's like, putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It might look okay on the surface, but the problem's still there.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And if that bubble bursts, the consequences, they could be far-reaching and a lot more painful than if they had just addressed those underlying issues head-on in the first place.
Right, so it's like delaying the inevitable and
Mm.
potentially making it even worse, which gives us even more to think about. So where does this leave, the average person who's just trying to navigate these crazy economic waters? What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
Information is power. That's what I always say. Don't just let the headlines dictate your decisions. Understand your own risk tolerance, do your research, and remember, what goes up must eventually come down. There's no substitute for careful research and a long-term perspective.
Excellent advice, as always. But here's a final thought, something to ponder. We've been really focused on the economic implications of China's actions, but what about the human element here?
Yeah.
I mean, if this gamble doesn't pay off, if things get worse, could it lead to, social unrest, particularly among those millions of unemployed young people we talked about? And then how might that, in turn, impact China's role on the global stage?
Now, those are questions with some really profound implications. And honestly, I think that warrants its own deep dive. The interconnectedness of economics and geopolitics and social dynamics, that's where things get really fascinating.
It certainly does. It gives us all a lot to think about. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these very complex issues. Remember, the journey of knowledge, it's ongoing. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.